August 23, 1942, 4:00 p.m. The sweltering heat of the Russian summer hangs heavy over the Volga River, pressing down on the dusty streets of Stalingrad. In the northern suburbs, Galina, a young factory worker, shuts her eyes against the glare, but a low, rhythmic vibration traveling through the soles of her shoes forces them open again. It is not thunder. The western horizon, usually a haze of golden wheat and dust, is suddenly stained by hundreds of black dots arranged in precise, terrifying formations. The Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet has arrived with a singular, deadly purpose, bringing a shadow that will eclipse the sun. Within seconds, the distant drone of engines is drowned out by the piercing shriek of falling munitions as thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiaries rain down. The wooden residential districts, dried to tinder by the relentless summer sun, do not merely catch fire, they vanish into a sudden, roaring inferno that consumes entire city blocks in a heartbeat. Asphalt melts into sticky black rivers, trapping those too slow to run. While the massive oil storage tanks on the riverbank rupture, they send plumes of thick, choking smoke billowing thousands of feet into the air, turning day into an apocalyptic night. Far below this aerial Armageddon, the soldiers of the German 6th Army, under the command of General Friedrich Paulus, watch the destruction with a mix of awe and professional satisfaction. They are the masters of Europe, the conquerors of Paris and Kiev, and they believe the blackened skeleton of the city ahead is simply the final obstacle before total victory in the east. The tank crews of the 16th Panzer Division, covered in the grey dust of the Kalmyk steppe, check their ammunition and fuel, confident that the demoralized Soviet defenders will break before the might of the Blitzkrieg tactical machine. But inside the burning city, panic is rapidly hardening into a grim, fatalistic resolve among the civilian population. There is no official evacuation order, for Joseph Stalin has decreed that the soldiers will fight harder for a live city than a dead one. Women, teenagers, and the elderly are handed shovels instead of train tickets, ordered to dig anti-tank ditches in the hard earth while ash falls like snow on their shoulders. The NKVD, the feared secret police, patrol the chaotic streets, checking identification papers and summarily executing anyone suspected of desertion or spreading defeatist rumors amidst the crumbling ruins. The strategic situation for the Soviet 62nd Army is nothing short of catastrophic as the German pincers threaten to close around them. General Lopatin, currently in command, struggles to maintain communications with his forward units as telephone lines are severed by the relentless bombing. His divisions are under strength, exhausted from weeks of retreat across the Don Bend, and lacking in heavy anti-tank weaponry needed to stop the German armor. Every report reaching his bunker speaks of defensive lines being overrun and units dissolving under the pressure of the combined air and ground assault that is hammering them without mercy. On the Volga River, the lifeline of the city, the paddle steamers and ferries of the Volga flotilla attempt a desperate evacuation of the wounded civilians and soldiers. This is a suicide mission, as the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers scream down from the smoke-filled sky to pick off the slow-moving targets. The water turns a murky red as ships are blown apart, sending sailors and refugees into the strong currents. Yet the remaining vessels continue their grim work. They dodge geysers of water and machine gun fire, knowing that they are the only connection between the dying city and safety. To the north of the city, the German 16th Panzer Division achieves a major tactical breakthrough, racing unimpeded toward the riverbank near the village of Rynok. As the lead Panzer IV tanks crest the final ridge, the tank commanders pop their hatches to gaze upon the broad, shimmering expanse of the Volga. They cheer and radio their superiors that they have reached the objective, believing they have cut the Soviet supply lines and effectively won the battle. They are unaware that reaching the river is only the beginning of an ordeal that will strip them of their humanity. The response from the Soviet side is immediate, desperate, and born of total necessity as the Germans approach the industrial district. At the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, the assembly lines do not stop even as the glass roof shatters under the impact of bombs. Workers, some still wearing their oil-stained overalls, climb directly into the driver's seats of T-34 tanks that lack paint. Radios, or gun sights. These unpainted steel beasts roar out of the factory gates and straight into combat, manned by the very hands that built them, driving headlong into the advancing German infantry in a chaotic, suicidal charge. The sheer intensity of the firestorm creates a localized weather system, sucking oxygen into the center of the city and generating hurricane-force winds of superheated air. This thermal cyclone rips the clothes off bodies and carbonizes trees in an instant, creating a landscape that looks more like the surface of a dead planet than a Soviet metropolis. The smoke column is so massive that it can be seen by pilots more than 200 miles away, a grim beacon marking the location where two totalitarian ideologies are about to collide with a ferocity never before seen in human history. Amidst this carnage, a young German lieutenant named Hans writes a letter to his wife back in Munich, using the fender of his half-track as a desk. He describes the burning city with a poetic detachment, assuring her that the resistance is crumbling and that he will certainly be home for the Christmas holidays. His words reflect the pervasive arrogance of the Wehrmacht at this stage of the war, a belief in their own invincibility that has been fed by 3 years of unbroken victories. He does not know that he will never see the Bavarian Alps again. In Moscow, the mood is tense as Joseph Stalin paces his office, demanding hourly updates from the front lines. He understands that the fall of Stalingrad would not only cut the vital oil supply route from the Caucasus, but would be a devastating political blow to his regime. He issues a directive that is transmitted to every officer and commissar in the sector. The city bearing his name must be held at all costs. There will be no retreat across the Volga, for there is no land for them on the other side. Only disgrace and execution. As the sun begins to set through the haze of smoke, the geography of the battlefield becomes a critical factor in the unfolding tragedy. Stalingrad stretches for nearly 20 miles along the western bank of the river, a long, thin strip of urbanization that prevents any traditional defense in depth. The defenders are trapped with their backs to the water, squeezed into a kill zone that is growing smaller by the hour. Every ravine, every basement, and every pile of rubble is being transformed into a strong point, turning the city into a labyrinth of lethal ambush sites. The German infantry, accustomed to the rapid maneuvering of open warfare, find themselves slowing down as they enter the twisted wreckage of the suburbs. The blitzkrieg relies on speed, communication, and air support, but the rubble-choked streets neutralize their tanks and scatter their formations. Here, the range of engagement drops from kilometers to meters, and the enemy is no longer a distant silhouette, but a desperate face in a window across the street. The technological superiority of the Wehrmacht begins to erode in the claustrophobic confines of the urban environment, replaced by the primitive brutality of close-quarters combat. Night does not bring darkness to Stalingrad on this date, for the fires burn with such intensity that one can read a newspaper in the streets at midnight. The constant roar of the flames is punctuated by the staccato rhythm of machine gun fire and the dull thud of artillery shells landing blindly in the ruins. Exhausted civilians huddle in makeshift bomb shelters carved into the clay cliffs of the Volga bank, listening to the destruction of their world. The boundary between soldier and civilian has dissolved. Everyone within the city limits is now a combatant in the struggle for survival. As August 23rd bleeds into the next day, the German Sixth Army prepares for what they believe will be the final mop-up operation of a defeated enemy. They tighten their grip on the northern and southern approaches. Oblivious to the fact that they are marching into a trap of their own making, the inferno has descended upon Stalingrad. But the fire will not cleanse the city. It will forge a battlefield where the standard rules of war no longer apply. The easy victories are over, and the time of the rat, the sniper, and the bayonet has begun. September 13, 1942. The German Sixth Army launches its massive ground assault into the heart of the city, believing that one final, decisive push will crush the remaining Soviet resistance. General Friedrich Paulus watches from his headquarters, confident that his panzer divisions, which have conquered half of Europe, will make short work of the ragged defenders clinging to the ruins. The infantry of the 71st and 295th Infantry Divisions move forward past the charred skeletons of trams and fallen telephone poles, their boots crunching on a carpet of shattered glass. They expect the demoralized Russians to surrender en masse, but instead, the rubble comes alive with a murderous hail of sniper fire and Molotov cocktails. The geography of Stalingrad immediately begins to work against the invaders, transforming their technological advantages into logistical nightmares. The Panzer IV tanks, designed for the open steppes where they can maneuver and utilize their range, find themselves trapped in narrow, debris-choked streets where their turrets cannot rotate. Soviet anti-tank riflemen, hiding in the upper stories of bombed-out department stores, fire down onto the thin top armor of the German vehicles with devastating precision. The Blitzkrieg, a doctrine built on speed and coordination, grinds to a screeching halt as the battle devolves into a series of isolated, vicious firefights for every single intersection. At the center of this maelstrom lies Mamayev Kurgan, a Tatar burial mound marked on military maps simply as Hill 102. It is the highest point in the city, offering a commanding view of the Volga River and the vital ferry crossings that supply the Soviet defenders. Possession of this blood-soaked hill means control of Stalingrad, and both sides pour reinforcements into the struggle with reckless abandon. The German infantry swarm up the slopes, supported by Stuka dive bombers that pummel the summit until the shape of the hill itself is altered by the sheer volume of explosives. The situation becomes critical for the Soviet 62nd Army as the Germans threaten to overrun the hill and cut the landing stages. In a desperate move, General Chuikov orders the 13th Guards Rifle Division, commanded by Major General Alexander Rodimtsev, to cross the Volga immediately. It is a suicide mission, undertaken in broad daylight under heavy German artillery fire that churns the river into a frothing cauldron of water and shrapnel. The guardsmen cram onto barges and fishing boats, watching their comrades die before they even reach the western bank, yet they fix bayonets and prepare to charge the moment their boots touch the mud. Rodimtsev's division lands and attacks straight off the boats, screaming their defiance as they rush up the slopes of Mamayev Kurgan without stopping to dig in. The fighting here is primal and savage, fought at such close range that grenades are thrown back and forth like deadly baseballs before they detonate. Men grapple in the dirt, using entrenching tools, knives, and even rocks when their ammunition runs dry, tearing at each other with a ferocity that shocks even the veteran German officers. The hill changes hands multiple times in a single day, covered in a layer of corpses so thick that the ground itself seems to bleed. While the battle for the hill rages, a different kind of horror unfolds in the southern district at the massive concrete grain elevator. This towering structure, dominating the skyline, becomes a fortress manned by a small, ragged detachment of the Soviet 10th Rifle Brigade and Naval Infantry. Cut off from the main force, these few dozen men hold out against an entire German division, turning the silos into an impregnable citadel. German artillery shells bounce harmlessly off the reinforced concrete walls, and tank rounds merely chip the surface, leaving the defenders inside shaken but alive and defiant. Inside the grain elevator, the conditions are apocalyptic as the ventilation systems fail, and the air fills with concrete dust and the smoke of burning wheat. The defenders fight in near-total darkness, choking on the fumes, their lips cracked and bleeding from extreme dehydration as their water supplies run out. They repel wave after wave of German infantry who try to storm the ground floor, firing machine guns down elevator shafts and dropping grenades through holes in the floorboards. The Germans, convinced they are facing a battalion-sized force, bring up heavy flak guns to blast the building at point-blank range. The German soldiers on the ground begin to refer to this new type of combat as Rattenkrieg, or rat warfare, a term that perfectly captures the degradation of the conflict. The front line is no longer a line on a map, but a three-dimensional maze that runs through sewers, basements, and the twisted steel skeletons of factories. A kitchen might be held by the Germans while the living room is held by the Soviets, with the enemies listening to each other breathe through the thin plaster walls. Capture of a street is measured in corpses rather than kilometers, and the average life expectancy of a new Soviet reinforcement is measured in hours. In the wreckage of the Stalingrad 1 railway station, the chaos reaches a fever pitch as the complex changes hands 14 times in just 6 hours. Companies dissolve into squads, and squads dissolve into lone survivors, hunting each other through the twisted wreckage of train cars and collapsed platforms. The station becomes a graveyard for the elite German infantry, who find that their superior training in maneuver warfare is useless in a place where death waits behind every pile of bricks. The noise is deafening and constant, a relentless cacophony of screeching metal and exploding mortar shells that drives men to the brink of insanity. The Luftwaffe continues to rule the skies, but their effectiveness is severely hampered by the close proximity of the combatants. German pilots, circling overhead like vultures, often cannot distinguish between friend and foe in the tangled ruin below. They drop their payloads on the city, but the rubble they create only provides more defensive cover for the Soviet snipers and machine gunners. The city is being pulverized into dust, but every collapsed wall creates a new firing position, and every bomb crater becomes a foxhole for a determined defender who refuses to retreat. General Chuikov, realizing he cannot match the German firepower, implements a tactic that will come to define the battle hugging the enemy. He orders his troops to keep their positions no more than 50 yards from the German lines, effectively neutralizing the German artillery and air support. If the Luftwaffe bombs the Soviet positions, they risk killing their own troops, forcing the Germans to rely solely on their infantry to dig the defenders out. This tactical embrace forces the Wehrmacht into a bloody war of attrition, exactly the kind of fight the Soviets are prepared to endure. Down by the riverbanks, the logistics of survival play out every night under the cover of darkness and the glare of flares. The Mosquito fleet of small boats and ferries braves the icy currents and German shelling to bring ammunition and food to the starving city. On the return trip, they carry the wounded, who lie groaning on the blood-slicked decks, praying that a mortar shell does not end their suffering before they reach the relative safety of the eastern bank. The river is the aorta of the defense, and the Germans pound it relentlessly, trying to sever the flow of blood that keeps the heart of Stalingrad beating. The psychological toll on the German soldier is immense, as the illusion of swift victory evaporates in the smoke of the burning city. Letters found on dead Wehrmacht troops speak of a growing despair, a sense that they have entered a place where God has turned his back. They describe the Russians not as men but as creatures of cast iron, beings who continue to fire their weapons even when enveloped in flames. The invincibility of the Aryan Superman is dying in the cellars of Stalingrad, replaced by a primal fear of the invisible enemy who strikes from the shadows. As September bleeds into October, the battle lines harden, and the city is effectively sliced into isolated pockets of resistance. The Germans have pushed the Soviets back to within mere hundreds of yards of the Volga in some places, yet they cannot deliver the final death blow. The industrial district in the north still churns out repaired weapons, and the stubborn defenders in the center continue to hold the key strongpoints. The meat grinder has chewed up division after division, and the gears are clogged with the dead of two nations. The initial phase of the assault is over, and the German High Command begins to realize that this will not be a battle of maneuver, but a siege of annihilation. They have taken 90% of the city, but the remaining 10% consists of the most fanatical defenders on earth, entrenched in a landscape that favors the defensive. The battle is about to shift from a fight for territory to a fight for survival, where the only passing grade in this academy of war is staying alive for one more day. Early October 1942 marks a fundamental shift in the psychology of the battle. Driven by the iron will of General Vasily Chuikov, sitting in his command bunker carved into the side of the Tsaritsa Gorge, the commander of the 62nd Army realizes that fighting a conventional defensive war against the Wehrmacht is a sentence of death. The German war machine is too efficient, too well coordinated, and possesses superior firepower that can smash any static line to pieces. Chuikov, coughing in the dust-choked air of his dugout, decides to rewrite the manual of urban warfare. He understands that to survive, his men must stop behaving like a regular army and start fighting like a collective of desperate, lethal individuals who use the ruins as a weapon rather than a shield. The cornerstone of this new doctrine is the tactic of hugging the enemy, a strategy born of pure necessity. Chuikov orders his forward units to position their trenches and foxholes no more than 50 meters away from the German positions, sometimes even closer. This proximity renders the terrified German radio operators unable to call in Luftwaffe airstrikes or heavy artillery barrages for fear of massacring their own troops. The terrifying screams of the Stuka dive bombers, which had dominated the opening weeks of the campaign, become less frequent along the contact line. The Germans are forced to fight man to man, bayonet to bayonet, stripping them of the technological advantage that allowed them to conquer Europe. To implement this brutal intimacy, the Soviet forces break down their large formations into small, highly mobile storm groups. These are not standard infantry squads but specialized kill teams armed with submachine guns, grenades, and Molotov cocktails. They discard heavy packs and cumbersome equipment, stripping down to the essentials needed for close-quarters murder. These groups operate independently, prowling the ruins like packs of wolves, tasked with seizing a single room, a stairwell, or a basement. They move silently through the debris, waiting until they can see the whites of the enemy's eyes before unleashing a torrent of violence that overwhelms the stunned German defenders. The primary weapon of the storm group is often not a firearm, which can jam or run out of ammunition, but the sharpened entrenching tool. The Soviet soldiers file the edges of their spades until they are razor-sharp, turning a digging implement into a terrifying battle axe. In the claustrophobic confines of a collapsed apartment block, where there is no room to swing a rifle, the spade becomes the king of battle. Veterans of the 62nd Army teach the new recruits how to strike at the neck or the junction of the shoulder, emphasizing silence and speed. The psychological impact of finding comrades hacked to death in the night begins to erode the nerves of the German infantry. Amidst this chaotic brawl, a new breed of soldier rises to prominence and legendary status: the sniper. The ruins of Stalingrad, with its thousands of hiding places and broken sightlines, create the perfect hunting ground for these patient killers. Vasily Zaitsev, a shepherd from the Urals who grew up hunting wolves in the snow, becomes the face of this invisible war, lying motionless for hours under a pile of bricks, wrapped in camouflage rags that blend perfectly with the grey dust. Zaitsev waits for a German officer to make a single mistake. He breathes in rhythm with the wind, his heart rate slowed by sheer force of will, until a helmet appears in his scope. Zaitsev and his fellow snipers do not just kill, they wage a campaign of psychological terror that paralyzes the German chain of command. A German officer cannot lift his head to scan the horizon with binoculars without risking a bullet between the eyes. Messengers running orders between units are cut down in mid-stride, severing communications and leaving units isolated. The snipers target the water carriers and the food distributors, weaponizing thirst and hunger against the invaders. The fear of the unseen marksman forces the Germans to move at a crawl, huddled behind walls, sapping the momentum of their offensive and draining their morale drop by drop. The duel between the snipers becomes a high-stakes game of chess played with live ammunition. Zaitsev establishes a sniper school in the ruins, teaching his students, whom he calls leverets, the art of the decoy. They rig helmets on sticks to draw fire, use mirrors to spot enemy positions, and learn to fire during the noise of artillery bursts to mask their location. They learn that a sniper's greatest asset is not his rifle, but his patience and his ability to outthink his opponent. The Germans respond by deploying their own elite marksmen, leading to tense, days-long standoffs where the first person to blink dies. While the snipers dominate the rooftops, a horrific subterranean war erupts in the intricate sewer system running beneath the city. The Germans, finding their advance blocked on the surface, attempt to use the large concrete storm drains to infiltrate behind Soviet lines. The Soviets respond by sending their own teams down into the darkness, creating a battlefield that resembles a vision of hell. Down in the slime and muck, where the only light comes from the muzzle flashes of submachine guns, men fight and die without ever seeing the sky. The echoes of gunshots are deafening in the concrete tubes, and the use of flamethrowers turns the tunnels into incinerators, consuming all oxygen and suffocating those who escape the fire. The basements of Stalingrad become independent fortresses, with garrisons that hold out long after their upper floors have been reduced to rubble. One such position, later known as Pavlov's house, exemplifies the tenacity of the defense. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a small platoon seize a 4-story apartment building that commands a strategic square, turning it into an impregnable bastion. They mine the approaches, knock holes in the walls for machine gun nests, and run communication trenches to the rear. For 58 days, this single building holds out against assaults that would have captured entire European cities, marking it on German maps as a fortress rather than a residence. Life in these forward positions is a study in human endurance and filth. Water is scarce, and food is often nothing more than a handful of dry crusts and vodka brought up by brave runners at night. The soldiers are covered in lice, their uniforms stiff with sweat and dirt, their eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. They learn to sleep in 10-minute bursts, waking instantly at the sound of a footfall on gravel. The distinction between day and night loses meaning, replaced by the rhythms of bombardments and attacks. Yet, a grim camaraderie forms among the survivors, a brotherhood forged in the fires of a city that is rapidly ceasing to exist. The role of women in the defense of Stalingrad expands significantly during this phase, moving beyond medical and signaling duties into direct combat. Young women serve as anti-aircraft gunners, traffic controllers at the chaotic river crossings, and even as snipers in Zaitsev's academy. Their presence on the front lines shames the men into fighting harder. For no Soviet soldier wants to be seen retreating while a woman stands her ground. They endure the same privations and face the same death, their courage becoming a vital thread in the moral fabric of the 62nd Army's resistance. The Germans, despite their frustration, continue to push forward with the grinding momentum of a heavy machine. They bring up assault guns and combat engineers armed with demolition charges to blast the Soviets out of their holes one by one. They realize that they are no longer fighting a disorganized rabble, but a seasoned, hardened enemy that has adapted perfectly to the environment. The German infantrymen, once clean-shaven and confident, now look like ghosts, their faces gaunt and their eyes hollow. They write home about the rat war, complaining that for every room they conquer, another two seem to sprout new defenders. General Chuikov remains the anchor of this defense, moving his headquarters whenever the German shelling threatens to bury him alive. He is a ruthless commander who does not hesitate to execute cowards or incompetents, but he shares the risks of his men. He stays on the west bank of the Volga, refusing to evacuate even when the Germans are only a few hundred meters away. His presence is a tangible signal to every soldier in the city there is no escape, there is no retreat, and they are all in this together until the bitter end. As October progresses, the nature of the battle changes the city itself. The landmarks are gone, replaced by piles of brick and twisted steel that have their own names, known only to the soldiers who fight for them. The nail factory, the chemist's shop, and the Red House become coordinates of death. The streets are blocked by mountains of debris, forcing the fighting into the vertical dimension. Men fight from floor to floor, blasting holes in ceilings to drop grenades on the enemy below, turning multi-story buildings into layer cakes of opposing forces. This period, known to the survivors as the Academy of Survival, weeds out the weak and the unlucky with brutal efficiency. A new arrival at the front has a life expectancy of less than 24 hours. If he survives the first day, he learns to distinguish the sound of a mortar from a howitzer. If he survives the first week, he learns how to move without making a sound and how to kill without hesitation. Those who graduate from this academy are the most dangerous soldiers on earth, forged in a crucible of fire and blood, ready to face the impending horror of the battle for the industrial district. By the middle of October 1942, the center of gravity in the Battle of Stalingrad shifts north toward the colossal industrial district, a sprawling landscape of steel and concrete that will become the graveyard of the German offensive. The German High Command, frustrated by the stubborn resistance in the city center, decides to hurl the full weight of the Sixth Army against the three giants of Soviet industry, the Dzerzhinsky tractor factory, the Barricady gun factory, and the Red October steel plant. These are not merely factories but self-contained cities of iron, stretching for miles along the riverbank, filled with massive workshops, rail yards, and workers' housing blocks that have been turned into fortified strongpoints. On the morning of October 14, the Germans unleash a bombardment of such apocalyptic intensity that it surpasses everything seen in the previous 2 months of combat. Thousands of tons of high explosives pulverize the tractor factory, turning the concrete workshops into twisted labyrinths of rebar and dust. General Friedrich Paulus commits 3 infantry divisions and 2 panzer divisions to a frontage of only 3 miles, creating a density of attacking force that is almost mathematically impossible to stop. The ground shakes so violently that seismographs in laboratories as far away as Moscow register the tremors. leading scientists to believe an earthquake has struck the southern Volga region, inside the shattered remains of the tractor factory. The soldiers of the 37th Guards Rifle Division, commanded by General Zholudev, prepare to face the armored onslaught with little more than hand grenades and anti-tank rifles. The fighting moves inside the massive assembly halls, where the cavernous spaces magnify the roar of battle into a deafening, continuous thunder. German tanks drive directly onto the factory floor, maneuvering between the silent machinery and the unfinished hulls of T-34 seconds that still sit on the assembly lines. The Soviet defenders hide in the overhead gantries and crane walkways, dropping bundles of grenades onto the engine decks of the panzers below, turning the factory into a multi-dimensional kill zone. The combat within the industrial sector is savage and unrelenting, often reduced to hand-to-hand struggles in the dark. Soot-filled tunnels that connect the various workshops. Men kill each other with sharpened screwdrivers, wrenches, and heavy iron bars scavenged from the debris of the factory floor. The air is thick with the acrid smell of burning rubber, cordite, and the metallic tang of blood, creating a toxic atmosphere that stings the eyes and lungs. There is no front line here, only a chaotic series of isolated pockets where small groups of men fight until they are overrun or until they run out of ammunition. As the German pressure intensifies, the Soviet defensive perimeter shrinks dangerously close to the Volga, in some places reduced to a strip of land less than 300 yards deep. The famous "not a step back" order, issued by Stalin months earlier, transforms from a political slogan into a terrifying geographical reality. There is literally nowhere left to retreat to, as the steep clay cliffs of the riverbank offer the only cover from the relentless German fire. To withdraw is to die in the freezing water, to stay is to die in the ruins. The soldiers of the 62nd Army choose to stand their ground, fighting with the desperation of men who have accepted their own mortality. The battle then rolls southward into the Barricadi gun factory, a massive complex of brick buildings and smokestacks that dominates the central part of the industrial district. Here, the German 305th Infantry Division, specialized in urban assault, pushes forward with flamethrowers and demolition charges, blasting the Soviets out of the cellars and sewers. The fighting is so intense that the factory complex is sliced into slivers of control, with the Germans holding one end of a workshop while the Soviets hold the other. The machinery of the factory, once used to build heavy artillery for the Red Army, now serves as cover for the infantrymen who are bleeding to death on the concrete floors. A catastrophic crisis emerges near the Barricadi when the German forces manage to punch a hole through the Soviet lines and reach the Volga, splitting the 62nd Army in two. This breakthrough isolates the 138th Rifle Division, commanded by Colonel Ivan Lyudnikov, on a tiny patch of land behind the factory that becomes known as Lyudnikov's Island, cut off on three sides by the enemy and on the fourth by the river. Lyudnikov's men are trapped in a pocket measuring only 700 by 400 meters. They are subjected to constant mortar fire and sniper attacks, yet they refuse to surrender, holding out with a tenacity that defies all military logic. Inside the Red October steel plant, the fighting takes on a surreal, almost Gothic quality as the combatants struggle among the massive Martin furnaces and mountains of slag. The furnaces, some still radiating heat from the fires that went out weeks ago, become macabre bunkers where machine gun crews set up their nests. The twisted metal of the destroyed infrastructure creates a landscape of sharp edges and deep shadows, perfect for the ambush tactics of the Soviet storm groups. German assault pioneers, heavily laden with satchel charges, try to blow up the hardened Soviet positions, but they are often cut down by accurate rifle fire from the maze of overhead pipes. The situation for the Soviet supply lines becomes critical as the winter sets in and the first ice begins to appear on the Volga River. The floating ice floes pose a deadly threat to the small boats and barges of the Volga flotilla, crushing hulls and clogging the propellers of the rescue vessels. The road of life across the river becomes a road of death, as supplies of food and ammunition dwindle to a trickle. The wounded, waiting on the riverbank for evacuation, freeze to death in the biting wind or are killed by German artillery shells that rain down on the exposed landing stages. Despite their tactical gains, the German Sixth Army is bleeding itself white in the industrial meat grinder, losing thousands of men for every 100 yards of ground gained. The specialized combat engineer battalions, flown in from Germany specifically to clear the factories, suffer casualties of over 50% within days of their arrival. These elite troops, experts in demolition and close-quarters battle, find their skills negated by the sheer fanaticism of the Soviet defense. The German infantrymen are exhausted, their uniforms in tatters, their ammunition pouches empty, and their faith in victory shaken by the endless stream of resistance that pours from every ruin. General Chuikov's headquarters is forced to relocate repeatedly, moving into precarious dugouts dug into the clay of the riverbank as the Germans bring direct fire to bear on his command posts. The vibration of the constant explosions threatens to collapse the earthen walls, and the general himself is often covered in dust and debris while issuing orders over the field telephones. Communications are maintained by brave signalmen who crawl through the fire-swept ruins to splice broken wires, often sacrificing their lives to keep the chaotic army connected. The command structure of the 62nd Army is hanging by a thread, yet the will to resist remains unbroken. In the workshops of the Red October, the battle devolves into a primitive struggle for survival, where the primary objective is simply to endure the night. The combatants are so close that they can hear the enemy eating, coughing, and crying out in pain, creating a bizarre intimacy amidst the slaughter. Truces are occasionally arranged by shouting across the barricades to allow for the recovery of the wounded, only for the killing to resume minutes later. The factory floor is carpeted with the bodies of the fallen, which freeze hard in the dropping temperatures, becoming gruesome sandbags used by the living to absorb bullets. The German offensive reaches its culmination in mid-November with Operation Hubertus, a final, desperate attempt to scour the remaining Soviet defenders from the riverbank. They deploy their last reserves of combat pioneers and fresh infantry, throwing them into the ruins of the Red October and the Barricadi in a suicidal wave. They manage to reach the river in several places, firing their machine guns into the water and disrupting the Soviet ferry crossings. But they cannot dislodge the last pockets of resistance. The Soviet soldiers, clinging to the cliffs like limpets, beat back the assaults with the fury of men who know that death is the only alternative to victory. As the temperature plummets and the first heavy snows begin to fall, the battlefield transforms into a white wasteland, scarred by black craters and grey ruins. The exhaustion on both sides is palpable. The frantic energy of the October assaults has given way to a numb, grinding attrition. The Germans have taken 90% of the city, but the factories have broken the back of their infantry divisions. They stand on the banks of the Volga, looking at the ice-choked water, unaware that they have extended their arm too far and that the trap is about to snap shut. The industrial district of Stalingrad now stands as a monument to total war, a place where the industrial capacity of man has been turned solely toward his own destruction. The blast furnaces are cold, the assembly lines are silent, and the chimneys are toppled. But the ruins are alive, with the sounds of the sniper's rifle and the burst of the submachine gun. The German 6th Army has captured the map of Stalingrad, but they have failed to capture its soul. The factories of death have done their work, and now, out on the frozen steppes to the northwest, the Soviet retribution is gathering like a storm. November 19, 1942, 0720 a.m. A heavy, freezing fog blankets the rolling steppes to the northwest of Stalingrad, reducing visibility to mere yards. The air is so cold that breath freezes instantly on mustaches, and the silence is absolute, broken only by the wind whistling through the dry steppe grass. In the trenches of the Romanian Third Army, huddled in their thin greatcoats, sentries squint into the white void, stamping their feet to keep the blood flowing. They are unaware that just a few miles away, the horizon is bristling with the barrels of 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces and heavy mortars, all elevated and aimed directly at their frozen positions. For months, the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, has been executing a masterclass in maskirovka, or military deception, moving over 1 million men and thousands of tanks into position under the very noses of German intelligence. Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky have identified the fatal weakness in the German deployment. The flanks of the 6th Army are guarded not by elite Wehrmacht troops, but by their ill-equipped Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian allies. These satellite armies lack heavy anti-tank weapons. Their morale is brittle, and they are stretched thin over hundreds of kilometers of open terrain. The trap has been set with mathematical precision, and the spring is coiled tight, ready to unleash a catastrophic release of kinetic energy. Suddenly, the sky above the steppe is torn apart by a single command phrase shouted into field telephones across the Don front siren. The artillery barrage that follows is of such violence that it physically alters the landscape, churning the frozen earth into a boiling sea of mud and fire. For 80 minutes, the Romanian positions are hammered by a relentless storm of high explosives and Katyusha rockets, known as Stalin's organs, which shriek as they launch their deadly payloads. Bunkers collapse. Communication lines are vaporized, and entire platoons are buried alive in their dugouts before they can even reach for their rifles. As the barrage lifts, a new sound emerges from the fog, a deep, guttural rumble that vibrates through the souls of the terrified survivors. Out of the mist, the T-34 tanks appear like iron monsters, their tracks churning the snow, carrying squads of submachine gunners on their engine decks. The Romanian soldiers, armed mostly with obsolete rifles and lacking effective anti-tank grenades, watch in horror as their bullets spark harmlessly off the sloped armor of the Soviet behemoths. Panic spreads like a contagion through the ranks, and the defensive line disintegrates as men drop their weapons and flee into the open steppe, only to be run down by the advancing steel armada. In the headquarters of the German Sixth Army at Golubinskaya, the initial reports of the attack are dismissed as a local skirmish or a feint. General Friedrich Paulus, fixated on the grinding battle within the city ruins, fails to grasp the strategic magnitude of the disaster unfolding on his flanks. He believes the Russians are exhausted and incapable of a large-scale offensive, a delusion fed by faulty intelligence and his own desperate wish for victory. By the time the realization strikes that this is a massive encirclement operation, the Soviet armored spearheads are already miles behind the German lines, severing supply routes and overrunning airfields. The only reserve force available to stop the deluge is the 48th Panzer Corps, commanded by General Heim, but it is a shadow of a fighting formation. Many of its tanks have been sitting idle in dugouts for weeks, protected by straw insulation that has attracted thousands of field mice seeking warmth. When the crews rush to start their engines, they discover that the rodents have chewed through the electrical wiring, rendering a significant portion of the tanks useless. The remaining armor rolls out to meet the Soviet tidal wave, but they are outnumbered and outmaneuvered, swept aside like driftwood in a flood as the Soviet 5th Tank Army races toward the Don River. On November 20, the second jaw of the trap snaps shut to the south of the city. The Stalingrad front, commanded by General Yeremenko, launches its own offensive against the Romanian Fourth Army. The result is a mirror image of the northern disaster. The defenses crumble under the weight of the Soviet mechanized corps, and the Romanian troops break and run. The Soviet pincer movement is now fully in motion, two massive armored claws sweeping across the snowy plains, aiming to meet at the town of Kalach-na-Donu, 40 miles west of Stalingrad. The speed of the advance is breathtaking, a blitzkrieg in reverse that leaves the German commanders paralyzed with shock. The strategic key to the entire operation is the bridge across the Don River at Kalach, the only crossing point capable of supporting heavy tanks. If the Germans blow the bridge, the Soviet advance will halt, giving the Sixth Army time to regroup or escape. Recognizing this, the Soviet commanders dispatch a daring advance guard, led by Lieutenant Colonel Filipov, to seize the bridge intact. Under the cover of darkness, Filipov's tanks turn on their headlights and drive boldly onto the bridge, mimicking a German training column. The German guards, confused by the audacity of the move, wave them through, realizing their mistake only when the Soviet tanks open fire at point-blank range. The capture of the Kalach Bridge is the final nail in the coffin for the German Sixth Army. With the crossing secured, the northern and southern pincers race toward each other across the frozen landscape, ignoring isolated pockets of resistance in their haste to close the ring. The German logistical tale, the vast network of depots, workshops, and horse-drawn convoys that sustains the army, is thrown into chaos. Trucks are abandoned, field hospitals are overrun, and staff officers are captured in their pajamas as the war they thought was miles away suddenly arrives at their doorstep. On the afternoon of November 23, near the village of Sovetski, the lead tanks of the southwestern front spot green flares rising from the snowy horizon to the south. They fire green flares in return, and moments later, the soldiers of the two Soviet fronts run toward each other, cheering and embracing in the snow. The cameramen are there to record the historic handshake between the commanders of the tank corps, a scene that signals the doom of the Sixth Army. The encirclement is complete. The trap has snapped shut, and inside the Kessel, or cauldron, nearly 300,000 Axis troops are now cut off from the outside world. Inside Stalingrad, the German soldiers fighting in the ruins are initially unaware of the catastrophe that has taken place behind them. They notice only that the flow of mail has stopped and that the ammunition supplies are being rationed more strictly. Rumors begin to circulate through the trenches. Whispered stories of Russian tanks roaming freely in the rear, of airfields burning, and of generals fleeing. The arrogant confidence that marked the summer offensive evaporates, replaced by a creeping dread. They look to the west, where the sun sets, and realize that the horizon is now enemy territory. Back in Germany, Adolf Hitler receives the news of the encirclement with a furious denial of reality. He forbids the Sixth Army from breaking out, declaring that Stalingrad will be held and transformed into a fortress. He ignores the pleas of his generals, who beg him to allow Paulus to retreat while he still has fuel and ammunition. Hitler is bolstered by the reckless promise of Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, who assures him that his air force can supply the trapped army by air. It is a fatal delusion, a promise made on vanity rather than logistics, sealing the fate of 250,000 men. The geography of the battlefield has now fundamentally inverted. The besiegers have become the besieged, the German Sixth Army. Once the tip of the spear aimed at the heart of Russia, is now a frantic animal trapped in a cage of steel and ice. The area of the pocket, measuring roughly 30 miles wide and 20 miles deep, is a barren wasteland with no natural defenses against the coming winter. There are no forests for firewood, no stockpiles of food, and no warm clothing for the troops who were expected to be home by Christmas. As the reality of the situation settles in, the Soviet forces immediately begin to reinforce the outer ring of the encirclement, digging in to repel any relief attempts. They also tighten the inner ring, compressing the trapped Germans into an ever-shrinking killing zone. The hunters of the 62nd Army, who have spent months with their backs to the Volga, now realize that the pressure is easing. They hear the distant thunder of artillery to the west and know that salvation has arrived. The roles have been reversed. The German soldier is now the rat in the trap. November ends with the steppes covered in deep snow, the temperature dropping to minus 30 degrees Celsius. The stage is set for a tragedy of epic proportions. Inside the cauldron, the largest field army Germany has ever assembled is about to undergo a slow, agonizing death by starvation and freezing. The brilliant maneuver of Operation Uranus has changed the course of World War II in a single week, transforming the strategic map of Europe and marking the beginning of the long, bloody road to Berlin. The trap is shut, and there will be no escape. December 1942 settles over the Stalingrad pocket like a shroud of white marble, sealing the fate of the trapped Sixth Army in a frozen tomb. Inside the Kessel, or cauldron, the conditions rapidly deteriorate from desperate to apocalyptic as the temperature plunges to 30 degrees below zero. The German soldier, once the proud conqueror of Europe, is reduced to a shivering, lice-ridden figure wrapped in stolen women's shawls and rags. Frostbite becomes a more immediate enemy than the Soviets, turning fingers and toes black and gangrenous within hours of exposure. There is no wood for fires, so men burn furniture, books, and eventually the wooden parts of their own bunkers just to keep their blood from freezing solid in their veins. The promised lifeline from the sky, the Luftwaffe airlift that Hermann Göring swore would deliver 500 tons of supplies daily, is a catastrophic failure from the start. The winter storms over the steppe are relentless, grounding the transport fleets for days at a time and icing up the wings of the Junkers due 52 seconds that dare to fly. On the best days, the airlift manages only a fraction of the required tonnage, delivering useless items like marjoram and summer uniforms instead of fuel and ammunition. The pilots fly through a gauntlet of Soviet anti-aircraft fire, their burning planes dotting the snowy landscape like grim bonfires that mark the path to the doomed city. At the Pitomnik and Gumrak airfields, the only links to the outside world, scenes of utter pandemonium unfold every time a transport plane touches down. Wounded soldiers, their bandages frozen stiff with pus and blood, drag themselves across the ice toward the taxiing aircraft, begging to be taken aboard. Field police use rifle butts to beat back the desperate mobs, enforcing a ruthless triage where only the walking wounded with specific passes are allowed to leave. As the planes take off, men cling to the landing gear struts, falling to their deaths from hundreds of feet in the air as their grip fails in the freezing slipstream, their bodies shattering on the hard-packed snow below. Starvation becomes the defining reality of daily existence within the pocket, gnawing at the sanity of every man from the lowest private to General Paulus himself. The daily ration is slashed to a few slices of bread and a bowl of watery soup made from melted snow and horse bones. The thousands of horses that once pulled the 6th Army's artillery are slaughtered for meat, their frozen carcasses hacked apart with axes and bayonets. When the horses are gone, the soldiers hunt for dogs, cats, and even rats in the ruins, driven by a primal hunger that overrides all civilized taboos. Men collapse and die while standing in line for food, their hearts simply too weak to pump blood through their emaciated bodies. Outside the ring of death, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein launches Operation Winter Storm, a desperate attempt to break through the Soviet encirclement and rescue the 6th Army, General Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, spearheading the relief effort, smashes into the Soviet outer perimeter with the ferocity of a cornered beast. For a brief, intoxicating moment, it seems that the miracle might happen as the German tanks drive northeast, crushing Soviet infantry positions and rolling steadily toward the pocket. The soldiers inside the cauldron press their ears to the frozen ground, listening for the distant rumble of friendly guns, praying that the Tiger tanks are coming to save them. However, the Soviet command reacts with lightning speed, deploying the powerful 2nd Guards Army under General Rodion Malinovsky to block Manstein's path. The steppes become the stage for a titanic armored clash, where T-34 and KV-1 heavy tanks duel with the German panzers in a swirling blizzard. The fighting is savage and confused, with tanks firing at muzzle flashes in the whiteout conditions, their tracks slipping on the icy ground. The fresh Soviet reserves, well-fed and clothed in thick winter gear, absorb the German blow and begin to grind the relief force to a halt. Every mile gained by Manstein costs him precious fuel and tanks that he cannot replace, bleeding his force dry just short of the objective. By December 19, the lead elements of Hoth's Panzer Division reach the Mishkova River, only 30 miles from the edge of the Stalingrad pocket. The flashes of their artillery are visible on the night horizon, tantalizingly close to the trapped men who watch with tears in their eyes. This is the critical moment, the only window of opportunity for the 6th Army to launch a breakout, codenamed Operation Thunderclap, to link up with the rescuers. But General Paulus, paralyzed by his obedience to Hitler and the lack of fuel for his vehicles, refuses to give the order. He sits in his headquarters, a prisoner of his own chain of command, while the lifeline slowly begins to fray and snap. Christmas Eve inside the Kessel is a night of surreal horror and poignant sorrow, celebrated in bunkers illuminated by the flickering light of Hindenburg candles. Soldiers sing Silent Night with cracked voices, tears streaming down faces ingrained with the dirt of months of siege. In a dugout near the tractor factory, a doctor named Kurt Ruber sketches the Stalingrad Madonna on the back of a Soviet map using a piece of charcoal. The drawing, depicting a mother and child with the words light, life, love, becomes a sacred icon for the doomed men, a fragile symbol of humanity in a world that has been entirely given over to death. The psychological impact of the failed relief effort shatters the remaining morale of the 6th Army as the new year approaches. When Manstein is forced to withdraw to prevent his own encirclement, the realization hits the troops like a physical blow. No one is coming for them. The distant thunder of the German guns fades away to the west, replaced by the ominous silence of the steppe and the loudspeaker broadcasts of the Soviet propaganda units. The Russians play the ticking of a clock over the ruins, intercut with a monotone voice announcing, "Every 7 seconds, a German soldier dies in Russia. Stalingrad is a mass grave. The hospitals within the pocket are scenes from Dante's Inferno, overflowing with tens of thousands of wounded and sick men for whom there is no medicine. Without anesthetics, amputations are performed with hacksaws while patients are held down by their comrades, their screams muffled by rags stuffed in their mouths. Typhus and dysentery sweep through the crowded cellars, spreading through the lice that infest every seam of clothing. The dead are stacked outside the bunkers like cordwood, frozen into grotesque statues that are eventually used to reinforce parapets. As the ground is too hard to dig graves, discipline begins to unravel as the hopeless situation erodes the rigid hierarchy of the Wehrmacht. Soldiers wander away from their units, hiding in the cellars of the ruined city, waiting for the end in a catatonic stupor. Suicide becomes a common escape, with men choosing a quick bullet over the slow agony of starvation or the terror of Soviet captivity. Officers who try to enforce order are sometimes ignored or threatened, their authority dissolving in the face of the universal sentence of death that hangs over the entire army. The once mighty Sixth Army is devolving into a mob of armed, starving ghosts haunting the ruins of the city they destroyed. The Luftwaffe's failure becomes total as the Soviets overrun the forward airfields, pushing the transport planes further back and increasing the flight time. The daily tonnage drops to virtually nothing, and the pilots, exhausted and demoralized, can no longer brave the wall of flak that surrounds the pocket. The last letters flown out of Stalingrad carry a tone of finality, of men saying goodbye to wives and children they will never see again. They write of their betrayal by the leadership, of the senselessness of their sacrifice, and of a cold that seems to have frozen their very souls. As January begins, the Soviet ring tightens mercilessly, compressing the pocket into a smaller and smaller area. The artillery fire from all sides becomes so concentrated that there is no safe place left in the entire cauldron. The Soviet commanders, sensing the end is near, send an ultimatum to Paulus, offering honorable surrender terms to avoid further useless slaughter. They promise medical care for the wounded and food for the starving. But Hitler forbids acceptance. Ordering the army to fight to the last man and the last bullet, Paulus rejects the offer, condemning his men to 3 more weeks of meaningless agony. The fortress Stalingrad is now nothing more than a few jagged ruins and holes in the ground, defended by men who are literally dying on their feet. The ammunition is almost gone, the fuel tanks are dry, and the horses are all eaten. The myth of the Aryan Superman has been buried under the Russian snow, replaced by the reality of a defeated, broken army. The turning point of the war has passed, and history is holding its breath for the final collapse. The Kessel has done its work. The bone and muscle of the Wehrmacht have been boiled away, leaving only the skeleton of an army waiting for the final blow. January 10, 1943. The end begins not with a whimper, but with a thunderous roar as General Rokossovsky launches Operation Ring, the final strategic phase designed to annihilate the remnants of the German Sixth Army. After Paulus rejects the surrender ultimatum, the Soviet Don front unleashes a massive artillery barrage that rips through the shrinking German perimeter from all sides. The Soviet infantry, supported by heavy tanks that can now maneuver freely over the frozen ground, surge forward against the starving defenders. The German lines, manned by soldiers who are now little more than skeletons wrapped in rags, finally begin to buckle and snap under the overwhelming pressure. There is no tactical maneuvering left, only a brute force compression of the pocket into the ruins of downtown Stalingrad. The resistance offered by the German troops in these final days is a testament to the terrifying power of discipline and desperation. Even as they freeze to death in their foxholes, many continue to fire their machine guns until the barrels melt or the ammunition runs dry. However, the cohesion of the army is gone, units are mixed together in a chaotic jumble, and officers have lost contact with their superiors. The hospitals are overrun by the advancing Soviets, who find scenes of indescribable horror, thousands of frozen corpses stacked like firewood outside the bunkers, and the living lying in their own filth, too weak to brush away the lice that swarm over their faces. By January 26, the Soviet forces link up at Mamayev Kurgan, effectively slicing the German pocket into 2 isolated cauldrons, a southern group in the city centre containing Paulus's headquarters, and a northern group in the factory district. The revered hill, which had changed hands so many times during the autumn, is finally and firmly in Soviet hands. From its blood-soaked summit, the Red Army commanders can look down upon the devastation they have wrought and see the end of the invaders. The German defense has lost its spine, and the isolated groups are now fighting merely to delay the inevitable for a few more hours. On January 30, the 10th anniversary of the Nazi seizure of power, Adolf Hitler sends a final radio message to Friedrich Paulus. It is a promotion to the rank of General Feldmarschall, the highest rank in the Wehrmacht. The message carries a grim, implicit instruction: no German field marshal has ever been taken prisoner alive in history. Hitler fully expects Paulus to commit suicide, thereby preserving the honor of the military and creating a martyr myth for the crumbling Reich. Paulus, reading the message in the dank, foul-smelling basement of the Univermag department store, sees it for what it is, an invitation to die for a leader who has abandoned him. Paulus, a man of rigid Catholic faith and professional stoicism, looks at his staff officers and refuses the bait, declaring that he has no intention of shooting himself for the Bohemian corporal. In the ruined basement, which reeks of gangrene, unwashed bodies, and defeat, the newly minted field marshal prepares for the unthinkable. Above them, the sounds of battle grow closer, the thud of grenades and the shout of Russian voices echoing down the stairwells. The Sixth Army, the conqueror of Paris and the terror of the East, is ending its existence not in a glorious last stand, but in a dark cellar beneath a wrecked shopping centre. On the morning of January 31, a young Soviet lieutenant named Fyodor Yelchenko cautiously descends the stairs into the German headquarters, his submachine gun raised. He kicks open the door to find a room crowded with German officers who look more like ghosts than soldiers. In the corner, lying on a cot, is Friedrich Paulus, his face twitching with a nervous tic, unshaven and gaunt. The contrast is jarring. The highest-ranking officer in the German military, the commander of hundreds of thousands, surrendering to a 21-year-old lieutenant. Paulus surrenders his pistol, marking the formal end of resistance in the southern pocket and the first time a field marshal has ever capitulated. However, the fighting is not quite over, as General Strecker's XI Corps in the northern factory district refuses to lay down its arms. They hold out for 2 more days in the twisted wreckage of the tractor factory and the barricade, fighting with the fury of doomed men. The Soviets concentrate every available artillery piece on this final pocket, turning the industrial ruins into a churning volcano of fire and smoke. On February 2, 1943, the guns finally fall silent. A strange, heavy quiet descends over the city of Stalingrad for the first time in 5 months, a silence that is louder and more terrifying than the noise of battle. The aftermath of the surrender reveals the staggering scale of the German catastrophe on the banks of the Volga. Out of the original force of nearly 300,000 men who were encircled in November, only 91,000 remain alive to be taken prisoner. These survivors, hollow-cheeked and stumbling, are marched out of the city in long, grey columns that stretch for miles across the snow. They are headed for Soviet labor camps in Siberia and Central Asia, a journey that many will not survive. Of the 91,000 who march into captivity, only 5,000 will ever see Germany again, and most will not return until more than a decade later. The city of Stalingrad itself has ceased to exist as a functioning urban entity. It is now a jagged moonscape of brick and iron. In the spring thaw, the true cost of the battle is revealed as the snow melts to uncover layers of corpses that carpet the ground. The Soviets face a monumental task of sanitation to prevent plagues, gathering the bodies of friend and foe alike into massive pits. The soil is so saturated with metal fragments that for decades to come, magnetic needles will spin wildly in the area, and the earth will continue to vomit up the rusted remnants of the war. In Germany, the news of the defeat at Stalingrad lands with the impact of a physical blow to the national psyche. The Nazi regime tries to spin the disaster as a heroic sacrifice that saved the front, declaring 3 days of national mourning. But the truth cannot be hidden. The myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility has been shattered forever. The German people, who have been fed a diet of constant victory, suddenly realize that the war is lost. The shadow of Stalingrad lengthens over the Third Reich, a grim memento mori that whispers of the retribution that is slowly marching toward Berlin. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad is the turning point. The moment when the Red Army learned how to beat the Germans at their own game. The victory provides a colossal boost to morale, proving that the fascist beast can be bled and killed. The factories in the Urals redouble their efforts, churning out tanks and aircraft with the name Stalingrad painted on their sides. The strategic initiative passes permanently to the Soviet Union. From this day forward, the German army will do nothing but retreat, fighting a long, bloody withdrawal back to the gates of its own capital. The geopolitical shockwaves of the battle are felt around the world, from the resistance cells in occupied France to the halls of power in Washington and London. The sword of Stalingrad, a jeweled blade forged by order of King George VI, is presented to Joseph Stalin at the Tehran Conference as a tribute to the city's defenders. The battle becomes a symbol of human endurance and the terrible cost of freedom. It serves as a grim warning to any power that dares to underestimate the resilience of a people fighting for their very existence on their own soil. As the years pass, the city is rebuilt, rising from the ashes like a phoenix of concrete and steel, eventually renamed Volgograd. But the scars of the battle remain etched into the landscape and the memory of the world. A colossal statue, "The Motherland Calls," is erected on Mamayev Kurgan, a concrete woman with a sword raised high, screaming a silent cry of defiance across the steppes. Beneath her feet lie the bones of thousands of men who died for a few meters of dirt, forever bound together in the soil of the most blood-soaked battlefield in human history. The Battle of Stalingrad was not just a military engagement, it was a clash of civilizations, a total war where two ideologies wrestled on the edge of the abyss. It demonstrated the ultimate brutality of industrial warfare and the infinite capacity of the human spirit to endure suffering. The German Sixth Army marched to the Volga to conquer the world, but instead, they found their graveyard. The tide of World War II turned not on the beaches of Normandy or the sands of El Alamein, but in the frozen, rat-infested ruins of a Soviet industrial city, where the iron will of the defender finally broke the back of the aggressor. The river Volga flows on, indifferent to the history it witnessed, its waters dark and deep. But for those who know the story, the wind blowing off the steppes still carries the faint echoes of the Stuka's scream and the rattle of the submachine gun. Stalingrad remains the eternal reminder that there is a limit to tyranny, and that limit is drawn in blood. The story of the City of Steel ends here, but the long shadow it cast over the 20th century remains, a testament to the time when the world held its breath and watched the fate of mankind decided on the banks of a frozen river.